We were told that the CIA source was without reproach, and you know, sometimes you just have to take that at face value.
We knew that it was a high-priority mission with someone on the ground or somebody, some group of people on the ground, but we didn't know who it was. And we attacked the city, one coming in from the east, one coming in from the west. And we dropped simultaneously on the target just to the side of the river there.
In Baghdad, it was 5:30 in the morning. Minutes later, cruise missiles also hit the target, which was in the grounds of the Dora farm complex where Saddam's daughters lived.
The information from CIA was that they had an amazing source and that Saddam Hussein was basically out of business. There was a belief at the highest levels of the Pentagon and the White House that we had successfully killed Saddam. We got him. That's it. War's over. The problem is, we didn't get him. Shortly thereafter, Saddam is on television.
It was the first in a string of intelligence failures, and the attack had wrecked the plan to kill other regime leaders.
Once Dora Farm was struck, the Iraqi leadership knew that the war was on. They moved to civilian areas, and they basically left all of those places that were at the top levels of the target list.
Only after the war would the Americans discover the spy's story of Saddam and his secret bunker was entirely false.
Is there a bunker there? The intelligence community thinks there is. Afterwards, you go there, there's no bunker. Is Saddam Hussein there? Everyone thinks he is. Afterwards, no Saddam. What happened? I'm as puzzled as you are.
The British had been informed, but not consulted. Britain's top commander believed the raid was misconceived because Saddam's corpse would not have been available for display.
It was something which was very much an American lead on. They had the intelligence. And if we were to take him out, I would have thought it would be important to better show that we had taken him out. Demonstrable proof.
In the Iraqi oil fields just across the border, special forces watched in case Saddam retaliated by sabotaging oil wells. When news came in that 9 were ablaze, the land commander decided he had to attack immediately, a day before he'd intended.
We needed to secure the southern oil fields right away. That if we didn't, we ran an unacceptable risk that the regime could possibly sabotage those oil fields, create an environmental disaster. Therefore, we're ready, let's push this thing forward, and let's go. And by God, that's what we executed.
The invasion began. The American Fifth Army was to attack Baghdad from the desert west of the Euphrates. The American Marine Corps would attack through the inhabited areas east of the river. The British would secure Iraq's second city, Basra. The British began their advance.
Now crossing the Iraqi border.
Failings in the supply system and delays caused by the political controversy over the war meant the troops were short of ammunition and equipment to protect them from chemical and biological weapons.
I felt that we were carrying a lot of risk. The mood was one that we were not ready for this, that the soldiers at a personal level were not properly equipped, that we had problems with clothing, We had problems sourcing ammunition. We knew it was in theatre, but we couldn't find it.
The British hoped they wouldn't have to fight. The Shia Muslims of Basra in the south had suffered terribly under Saddam.
I thought once ground forces crossed into Iraq, that might be the trigger for a large-scale Shia insurgency.
We'd even gone as far as thinking about the possibility of arming those who were prepared to rebel.
But there were no welcoming crowds. 12 years before, the people of these same villages had risen up after the first President Bush called on them to overthrow Saddam. But the Allies had then failed to support the rising. Tens of thousands of men, women and children were executed or tortured.
They stuck a knife into my nose. They pulled out my teeth.
This time, the Shias were going to let the coalition do the fighting.
We could easily have attacked the regime. We had the weapons. But we were afraid the Americans wouldn't topple Saddam, and that he would then return and take his revenge.
On the second night, the main British force approached Basra. The Secret Intelligence Service, MI6, was negotiating by radio with some of the city's commanders. The British wanted the Iraqi army to help them police the city.
British okay for warrior, but I'm not too sure about tanks or not. Obviously, we checked. Everybody tanks in.
We told them our argument wasn't with them, it was only with the regime. We said, you know, surrender, and you can then rejoin your army under a new leadership. We even asked them to come and be part of our coalition.
It didn't happen. Instead, when the British probed the outskirts of the city, they met with fierce resistance.
This is our first major contact with the enemy that we can actually see now. They're on the ground, they're firing tracer, we're firing tracer. They would just walk up to tanks with RPGs on the shoulders, trying to get as close as they could. It's very frightening, especially when you see the whites in their eyes and they're throwing grenades at you. It's very frightening.
It was just a constant barrage for 16 hours. We were told that they were going to surrender in the droves and it was going to be like the first Gulf War, and that you would come across hundreds of men walking towards you with a weapon, no weapons and such, but I never saw any of that.
At first, the British encountered regular troops, but soon they found themselves under attack by paramilitary fighters, often dressed in civilian clothes.
They came forward very stealthily using civilian vehicles mounted with RPGs, heavy machine guns, and they used those a lot.
They were willing to fight till the end. They were willing to stay there against all odds.
The British had met the Fedayeen, a brutal militia commanded directly by Saddam's son, Uday. Recruited and trained from childhood, the Fedayeen were a threat coalition intelligence had largely failed to anticipate.
It was quite clear from those engagements that we were now up against something, but the size and scale of which we had yet to sort of really work out.
Saddam had put his most feared lieutenant in command of Basra, Ali Hassan al-Majid, Chemical Ali, a man the coalition hoped to kill.
The guy's a war criminal. He gassed the Kurds. He basically has a very special place in hell set aside for him.
Captured soldiers said their units wanted to surrender, but the Fedayeen and Chemical Ali's secret police forced them to fight.
They were held to account by somebody behind them with a gun, or their families were being detained and would suffer the consequences of their failure to act correctly.
British troops were also under attack in the nearby town of Az-Zubayr. Their commanders decided they needed to rethink tactics.
I spoke to Commander 7th Armoured Brigade and said, you work out your plan for Az-Zubayr and I'll work out my plan for Basra, and let's meet tomorrow morning.
And I remember him arriving, and I thought, well, I've got some views on this.
And he said to me, come around the corner, let's have a quick smoke break before you see my commanders. And he said to me, I've worked out, I could easily get into Az-Zubayr now with the most powerful armoured brigade the United Kingdom's ever put in the field. But if I do, I'll trash the place, I'll take unnecessary casualties myself, I will kill lots of civilians, and this can't be right. And I said to him, well, my conclusion was precisely the same for Basra.
So within the space of a cigarette, we'd both come to the same conclusion.
The British encircled the city, but allowed civilians to leave. MI6 agents inside Basra still hoped they could incite an uprising. Some in the American High Command were exasperated. They felt British caution made Saddam look strong. But British forces did not want to risk a bloodbath.
Taking down a city quickly would have been inviting us to attack it very hard, rubberlize it, to use one expression, but certainly to go fairly hard. And one of our campaign objectives was to make sure we concentrated on thinking about how we actually rebuilt the infrastructure once the war was over.
In Baghdad, Saddam's palaces and ministries had been bombed. It was a spectacle designed to convince the Iraqi people it was safe to overthrow the regime. Even if the buildings were empty.
You've got to hit something. And so if you don't know where these guys are and you're still developing the intelligence, you're still trying to figure out where they are, the war is on. You've got to hit your best stuff. And here's the best list that we've got, so we're going to go to town on it.
The American Marine Corps now planned to cross the Euphrates by capturing key bridges in the town of Nasiriyah. Like the British at Basra, they expected the local population and the Iraqi army to help.
There was a belief that they would capitulate as we got closer, and that there would not be much of a fight.
But inside Nasiriyah, hundreds of Fedayeen fighters were waiting. They'd instilled fear, and they were eager to fight.
They would tell us, if I kill an American, the regime will give me 1 million dinars. And they were tempted by that money. They didn't care about the city. In fact, the people of Nasiriyah wanted to welcome the Americans. All the key figures, the heads of tribes, the religious leaders, wanted to end the nightmare that had lasted for 35 years.
But even before the Marines could attack, a series of events unfolded that led to disaster. It started when a convoy of 18 American trucks drove past the waiting Marines. The 507th Maintenance Company serviced Patriot missile batteries. They weren't frontline troops. They intended to skirt Nasiriyah and rendezvous with the rest of their unit in the desert to the north.
We drove and drove and drove, and then we hit a concrete road.
They'd taken a wrong turn.
Next thing I look around where we're at, and it looks like we're driving through a city and the sun's getting ready to come up.
They'd stumbled into Nasiriyah. Initially, the Iraqi soldiers guarding the key bridge across the Euphrates showed little appetite for a fight.
They were actually waving at us, so we thought that they were just glad to see that we were there.
The convoy passed straight through the Iraqi front line. Then it turned around to escape.
On the turnaround, that's when we actually start receiving fire.
The Fedayeen had arrived.
We couldn't just really see where it was coming from, but we heard the shots being fired.
It was just pop, 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 all over the place. You really couldn't tell where it was coming from.
People hiding behind the buildings, firing their weapons. I could hear the shots actually piercing the vehicle that I was in. I noticed that I was hit in the arm. My hand was one way, and I looked back down, my arm was flipped over. I just tucked my arm and just said, I need to keep firing, we need to pull through.
Jackson and the vehicles ahead of him made it through the final Iraqi positions. The vehicles behind still had that gauntlet to run.
The first two vehicles managed to get through, but the Fedayeen hit the next three with rocket-propelled grenades.
Private Miller ran forward to try and help.
It was just a bloody mess. And I looked to see if anyone's alive, and to me there didn't look to be anybody alive. So I just kept moving forward.
In the wreckage was Private Jessica Lynch, later to be mythologized as an American hero when troops rescued her from an Iraqi hospital. At the time, Miller thought she was past help.
It looked to me like she was dead, as well as everyone else that was in that vehicle.
More and more Fedayeen arrived.
2 American soldiers got out of their vehicle. They ran towards their colleagues. A green car pulled up and 2 Iraqis got out and shouted at them. So the Americans held up their hands with their guns in the air. But the Iraqis shot them and they fell on their faces.
Miller spotted Fedayeen preparing to fire mortars at him.
I was shooting them as they were loading the mortar pit. And then finally, they stopped loading it. And then next thing I know, there's like a 360-degree circle around me of them just closing in. So that's when I had to surrender.
When Miller and other prisoners of war were paraded on Arab television that afternoon, the ambush seemed a metaphor for a war that wasn't turning out as expected. 11 Americans had been killed and 7 taken prisoner. The Fedayeen thought they'd beaten off an American attack. And fighters who had been thinking of surrender thought again.
It invigorated the fighting men. They decided to stay and to fight.
Outside Nasiriyah, the Marines still awaited the final order to attack the city. They were about to fight a battle they'd never expected. American Marines were about to assault Nasiriyah. They'd expected it to capitulate. But earlier that morning, a maintenance convoy had stumbled into the city ahead of the main attack. Its mauling by the Fedayeen had inspired local fighters. The battle which followed would change the course of the war.
I was anxious, a little excited. Nobody really knew what lied ahead.
We were all wearing our cold weather clothing because it was chilly, and it was kind of a grayish dawn. That's when the first signs of enemy resistance started. There were mortars impacting about 600 meters away from our forces, heavy machine guns began to be fired at us, and that gave you an indicator of what was to come.
They spotted Iraqi tanks.
And by the end of about an hour, we had about 9 enemy tanks that had been engaged and destroyed. Now we knew we might have a fight on our hands.
American tanks had been rescuing survivors from the earlier ambush. Now, only 4 had enough fuel to continue the advance.
We were running out of daylight, and I did not want to be in the middle of an attack to seize bridges while it was dark.
And the colonel at that point was, okay, push, let's take those bridges.
There's a lot of firing going on. You can hear it ricocheting off the road beside us.
You could hear the fire smacking off the bridge. I can remember seeing an RPG skip across the road in front of us. So I was like, okay, this is for real here. This is bad.
Once across the bridge, the tanks moved forward. Suddenly, disaster struck.
It was open ground. It appeared to be dry on top, but underneath was water, and they just sank to their chassis, and we got stuck.
They were coming at us. Right there was an Iraqi that we'd just killed, and right over there was 4 more Iraqis we just killed, and back over on the other side of the building there was 9 Iraqis that were killed by the tanks. So they were swarming on us.
I could really feel the pressure building. They were fearless. They weren't afraid to die. And it was like a human wave attack as they came pushing towards us.
Families died on the streets and in their homes.
We piled up corpses in front of the mortuary. March the 23rd was a black day for Nasiriyah, the toughest day. Wherever I went, children would run up to me, pleading for help with dead or wounded people.
A marine company advanced towards a key bridge on the northern edge of the city. Iraqi fighters were waiting.
They would duck behind a wall and they would fire an RPG, or they would pull out an AK-47 and they'd fire at you.
They were everywhere, on both sides of the road, high and low, and everybody was shooting.
Everywhere in Iraq had become a war zone, and so the civilians had fighters among them, from the army and from the Fedayeen. If the Americans saw you coming out of a street or a building with a gun in your hand, they'd just start shooting. They didn't care if it was a house with civilians in it or a school.
Coming through Ambush Alley with all the small arms and RPGs going off, I thought that was bad enough until I crossed that northern bridge. The land is blowing up all around you. Some of the artillery rounds hit so close they bounce you off the ground. It's extremely frightening.
An American aircraft arrived overhead, but instead of helping, it attacked the American position, adding to the casualties.
I was thinking that the casualties would be real high, extremely high.
An armored vehicle tried to take the wounded to the rear.
An RPG came sailing through the air. It plunged into the open troop hatch of the AAV, and there was just a catastrophic explosion as the Amtrak blew up with its occupants inside.
I had 18 of my Marines were killed in action and 14 wounded that day that were taken off the battlefield. So basically lost about 1/4 of our combat power on that day from one company. So, you know, emotionally, from that standpoint, thinking about the families and the Marines and it was very difficult.
After that point, we never heard anything about capitulation or anything after that. People approached the Iraqis, I think, with a much different perspective.
Helicopter to land now. We got a critical patient, needs to get out of here.
In one day, 29 Americans had died in Nasiriyah. With them died all hope that the Iraqi people would help the coalition overthrow the regime.
It didn't happen. It didn't happen in Nasiriyah. It didn't happen at other places in the South.
What worried the Americans even more was the thought of what lay ahead. The South was meant to be the easy part. In the Western Desert, American troops were now advancing towards the Republican Guard.
The closer we got to Baghdad, we expected a tougher fight. We expected the Republican Guard to be the formation that we were going to have to deal with, and we expected it to be a much more difficult and much more resolute defense.
Hidden in the countryside south of Baghdad were 4 Republican Guard divisions, perhaps 40,000 men. Their commander was confident he could produce a stalemate.
I thought we could hold out for 2 or 3 months, even 6 months, without the war reaching any conclusion. I thought we'd be able to turn Iraq into a mini Vietnam. I didn't think the Americans would be prepared to fight man to man.
32 Apache helicopters, the most deadly tank hunters in the world, were ordered forward. Each cost $22 million. Their job, to search out the Republican Guard's Medina division.
The regime resided in Baghdad, and the Medina division sat between us and Baghdad.
The plan was for a massive raid that very night. But as they prepared, they were being watched.
We established a force to stay behind enemy lines and gather information. They wore civilian clothes. They didn't carry any weapons. They used mobile phones to send and receive information.
When the Apaches took off, the Iraqi forces were ready.
For about the first 10 minutes we were okay. We really hadn't faced any fire. I'd seen a couple tracer strings, but that was about it.
But the ambush was about to be sprung.
The power grid of the entire town that we were going over had gone black and came back on within a few seconds.
That's when everybody started reporting taking heavy fire. We found out later that that was like a signal that they were using for people to go up on top of their roofs and shoot.
Fire was coming from the houses, the waterways, trees, shrubs, vehicles that are out there.
I was on the radio when I got hit. I've got earplugs in, I've got a helmet on, all the noise of the aircraft, but I could hear it enter my neck. I didn't want to touch my neck. I assumed that the front of my throat was gone.
The Apaches were forced to turn back before they even reached the Medina division.
I came over the squadron command radio and told all air crews to shoot at everybody that shot at them.
You know you're firing into areas where there are houses, where there's communities, and you don't want to have collateral damage. You try your best not to have collateral damage. But it became fairly evident that, in fact, you were going to have to, in order to survive this, you were going to have to return fire.
One Apache was shot down and its crew captured. Almost every helicopter was seriously damaged.
I remember coming back feeling very unsure of what really just happened there. Was it that we were one unit that had encountered an extreme amount of resistance and therefore had that happen, or was this as a broad spectrum? I really didn't know at that point, but I do know that for us at that point we were going to have some time to think about it because our airplanes were extremely battle damaged.
The Republican Guard remained largely unscathed. The Apache pilots' faith in American intelligence was shaken.
It was useless. It really was useless. At the risk of never making it above captain, like I said, there was definitely something wrong with the intelligence flow.
Nothing seemed to be working out quite as planned. Some American commanders began to fear that over-optimism had led them into a quagmire. The first week of the war had seen unexpected resistance. Coalition intelligence was proving unreliable at every level. And now a sandstorm of biblical proportions began to swirl across southern Iraq.
You could have been convinced that it was the apocalypse because it was that nasty out there. For a few hours, it was just an orange haze. Within about 5 minutes, it turned to pitch black out there.
I heard the guys walking to go to the bathroom about 20 yards from the vehicle. And they spend the next 3 hours looking for their vehicle again, you know.
The weather really sucked. You could literally not see more than about 30 or 40 feet with your naked eye.
And now came another surprise for Allied intelligence. Fedayeen fighters left the cities and attacked the supply lines of the lead units.
And they just kept coming, and they kept coming, and they kept coming. We started to realize that they weren't afraid to fight, and more importantly, they weren't afraid to die.
The advance stalled. The US Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld had pressured his generals to invade with smaller forces than they'd asked for. The man leading the attack on Baghdad was concerned an immediate attack would be reckless.
I wasn't real comfortable with the troop levels. I was very reluctant to head Baghdad because I wanted to make damn sure that when we did it, we were going to be decisive and successful.
In desert meetings, tempers flared.
In our profession, there's no such thing as a calm, measured discussion because what we're talking about is life and death. So they're passionate discussions.
But General McKiernan was determined to retain the initiative.
I said, we're going to have to accept some risk. And I want you to continue your attack rapidly to the north. Fast is better than slower. Fast is more lethal than slower. Fast is more final.
The American army now prepared to attack Baghdad. The lead units had to funnel through a mile-wide gap between a lake and the city of Karbala, the so-called Karbala Gap, and then assault across the Euphrates.
My commanders clearly understood that as soon as we moved through the Karbala Gap, it was going to be one fight all the way to Baghdad.
The Americans could not detect any Iraqi forces defending the gap. The man leading the spearhead unit feared that the area had been cleared for a chemical attack.
If there was one place that he could have used chemical weapons very successfully, was at the Karbala Gap.
That night, a signals intercept meant coalition troops were put on alert for imminent attack.
We intercepted a high-level radio transmission that had a simple word passed. It was blood, and we thought we knew what that meant.
Just before dawn, the Americans attacked into the gap. There was no chemical attack. Iraqi forces had pulled back, not to create a killing field, but because they felt too vulnerable in open desert.
There was a general order that there should not be a single Iraqi soldier to the west of the Euphrates River.
As the Americans attacked, Hamdani's phone rang. He was summoned to Baghdad to meet Saddam's son, Qusay.
Qusay told me he had an important message for me from President Saddam Hussein. The message was that everything that had happened over the past 2 weeks was a strategic deception, that the main enemy attack would come from the north of Baghdad. And therefore, I should pull out all my troops that were south of Baghdad.
Hamdani protested that at that very moment the Americans were attacking from the south.
Qusay approached me. He was almost whispering. He said, "General Raad, are you sure of what you are saying?" I answered, "Yes, as sure as I'm talking with you now." He knew I was telling the truth. I could see it in his face. But still, he ordered me to move my troops to the north. He gave the order not as an order from him, but as an order that he was obliged to obey.
The regime was crumbling.
As I left Baghdad, I looked at it as though I was seeing it for the last time. I could imagine the destruction to come.
The spearhead American unit was through the Karbala Gap. It raced towards its next objective.
Karbala Gap itself, if you seize the gap, you still don't win. You got to get across the river.
Months before, the planners had decided this bridge would carry the US Army towards the Iraqi capital. General Hamdani was fully aware of its importance.
This bridge could carry more than 150 tons in weight and was wide enough for armored troops to cross. I gave the commander of the demolition force clear, written, and verbal orders that as soon as he felt the enemy was close to the bridge, he should blow it up.
We fully anticipated this bridge to be mined, set with demolitions, and rigged to explode. And we wanted to capture the bridge intact.
I definitely saw wires. We wanted to destroy that wire, or we wanted to kill the guy who was in charge of that wire.
American engineers scrambled into boats and assaulted across the river to cut the demolition wires.
The first boat gets about 25% of the way across the river, and we start taking fire from the far side.
Suddenly the boat's engine failed. Hibner thought his men were doomed.
They're sitting ducks. I thought, my God, I just sent these guys to their death.
But smoke hid them from the Iraqis, and they got across.
We're on the far side of the bank now, taking really incredible amounts of small arms fire. We had cut all the wires, all the deck cord. We were very vulnerable at this point. We needed some heavy firepower.
So we assaulted across the bridge. We just pushed right through, just going as fast as we could to get a bigger foothold on the other side to get more troops across the bridge.
We didn't take any prisoners east of that bridge. East of that bridge, nobody surrendered. We had finally found the Iraqi Republican Guard.
By evening, the Americans controlled the bridge. 4 hours earlier, General Hamdani had been told to withdraw to the north of Baghdad. Now he was ordered to turn his units round and counterattack.
My own opinion was not to attack the Americans at this point. I felt we should surround them, contain them, then launch an offensive with a brigade of special forces. But the High Command insisted on an immediate offensive, which we were not ready for.
The American tank crews were in their new positions east of the Euphrates.
At 8 o'clock, it started to get dark, and I said, hey, let's try to get some rest. There's nothing going on. First sleep I've had in more than 36 hours.
We got the first report tank moving from east to west. We started getting reports of infantry moving in north. So now it looked like some sort of coordinated attack to try to retake the bridge.
General Hamdani had mustered his most elite troops, a brigade from the Medina division.
All of a sudden I see this armored vehicle pop up in front of me at 800 meters. Shot that one, and it was a humongous ball of flame, and we had shrapnel coming back down on us.
Iraqi tanks were advancing in a column down the road.
We destroyed upwards of 6 T-72s, and we pretty much stopped the entire brigade that was coming down us in their tracks.
It became a slaughter.
There was guys running up and down the road, there's big balls of fire going everywhere, some small on fire. We're still engaging with machine guns, so every time we see someone run across the road, we fire machine guns at them.
I didn't have a single tank intact. They were all either damaged or destroyed. I didn't have a single vehicle left. The battle reached a point where I myself, the army commander, was fighting with a Kalashnikov.
By 5:30, they were completely destroyed. The 10th Brigade had ceased to exist. I remember going there that morning and looking down that road and just unbelievable, could not imagine what was going through the Iraqi minds that night as they were trying to assault that position.
It's hard to describe it. Body parts just littered across the road. Vehicles still burning, still too hot to even get close to. The smell in the air is a smell I'll never ever forget. The burning flesh.
The Americans hadn't suffered a single casualty, but they were fearful, expecting this would be the first of many such encounters. The battle for Baghdad had begun. The Americans now advanced on Baghdad airport. Despite repeated intelligence failures, brute strength had got them this far. But symbolically and strategically, this was the most important objective yet.
Our job was to go get the airport and threaten Baghdad from the west and to take that regime icon away.
They expected fierce resistance. But as night fell, they weren't sure where it would come from or when.
We kept scanning on our thermal imaging and saw really nothing.
It appeared to be deserted.
The airport was completely black. A very, very eerie night. We just expected this huge battle with the Special Republican Guard, and it didn't happen. And we were extremely puzzled. And we were extremely tired.
Parked right next to the airport runway, Marcone's men got their first sleep in 48 hours.
The sun started to come up about 4:30. I was asleep on the top of my tank. And then I heard a tank shoot. And then I said, okay. So I get up and I look, and it was something that you would just not believe. Iraqis getting out of their beds, getting up to the sunshine, and scratching their heads and looking around and saying, oh my God. And us doing the same thing, saying, what in the hell is going on?
Baghdad had been under aerial bombardment for days. Confused by the constant noise, the Iraqi troops at the airport had slept through the initial American entry at the other end of the runway.
They were so close that tank commanders were using pistols and hand grenades from the hatches into the Iraqi bunkers.
People were running back and forth. They were shooting at us.
Over here. Don't even know what you're shooting at.
They were vicious there for that hour and a half because they really tried to get themselves together. I had tanks hit with RPGs. We had grenades, you know, blowing up all around us.
They were shooting at us, and we just engaged with everything we could.
Desperate, the Iraqis threw troops into the counterattack. Now the Americans came face to face with the teenage fanatics of the Baghdad Fedayeen.
We had to resist them, to fight them, to send them back to their own country. We are Iraqis. They're not even Christians. They're Jews.
These guys were doing like these suicide tactics, we called it. They're running out of these secure bunkers with basically AK-47s, run right at us.
The fighting was fierce. They had planes and tanks. And all we had were machine guns, rocket-propelled grenades, and hand grenades.
Then about 50 of the guys gave up. They were tired of watching their buddies die, I guess.
We had to withdraw. We just couldn't stand up to them. There were only about 25 of us left. Most of the Fedayeen were killed.
We crushed the forces in Saddam International Airport, and we cleaned the whole place of the airport by our...
In Baghdad itself, there was an air of unreality. The authorities remained defiant, and elsewhere, life continued as normal. The presence of militiamen on the streets, the only outward sign of crisis. On April the 4th, as fighting raged at the airport on the edge of the city, Iraqi TV even showed pictures of Saddam on walkabout in the west of Baghdad. But the Americans were not yet ready for the final assault. Still, they feared Saddam's Republican Guard. The key Republican Guard units had been positioned due south of Baghdad. The American advance had simply bypassed the bulk of them. Before the battle for Baghdad could begin, a brigade was dispatched south to deal with them. Air commanders said 80% of the Medina division had been destroyed, but the men on the ground needed to be sure. They found themselves in an area of dense palm groves.
We come in contact literally with hundreds of armored vehicles, artillery, air defense, etc. like that.
They found the most powerful armored division in the Iraqi army, almost entirely intact.
80% of their vehicles were still there, at least. They were dispersed and hidden so as not to be seen from the air.
It was another major intelligence failure.
I had moved all my troops to new positions. We created almost 7,000 new locations for our weapons, and we distributed enough ammunition to last for 6 months.
The Americans faced a battle they thought they'd never have to fight. But they'd caught the Iraqis by surprise. The American advance had been so fast, most of their tanks were facing the wrong way.
They would just hit so hard and so quickly, they just couldn't react to it. We just came upon them in close air support and artillery. It was just, I'm sure, more than they could even imagine, and it just developed so quickly, and our tanks and Bradleys are just going through their formation so quickly. It just becomes obvious that it's hopeless for them.
The Medina division simply melted away.
We'd see, a lot of middle-aged males walking away from battlefield areas. Some of them, would have like army boots on, but then they would have like kind of a civilian undergarment. And it was obvious that they probably had just taken their, uniform off and had just kind of walked away. And if they did that, in most cases, we just let them go.
General Hamdani made a last desperate attempt to stem the rout.
I tried to sneak to Usfia to try to salvage what was left of the Medina division. I found some troops, but there was no coherent force left. I gathered all of the troops together in one place, trying to form a nucleus of a solid force. Then I went to search for others. But when I got back, the troops had disappeared.
The Medina division had ceased to exist. Now the Americans were ready for the assault on Baghdad, but they remained cautious, fearful of being sucked into a bloodbath.
I think the sensing across the entire formation was that eventually we're going to have to conduct an armed reconnaissance into Baghdad in order to figure out what the hell this guy was going to do.
General Wallace asked the man who had destroyed the Medina division to come up with a plan.
All the pundits said, well, we only do deserts, we don't do cities, it'll be another Stalingrad, you lose 10,000 people in a city block.
But Colonel Perkins felt Baghdad was there for the taking. To prove it, he would conduct an armed raid into the city. He called it the Thunder Run. At dawn on April the 5th, American tanks rolled into Baghdad for the first time.
Silence. Silence in the command center at the audacity it was being displayed.
As we attacked up on Route 8 is definitely the most intense fighting we had seen yet, because we had this gauntlet of overpasses and buildings and roads and fighting positions that we fight through.
The Americans were driving straight into Baghdad's morning traffic, and many of the Iraqi defenders were dressed in civilian clothes.
80% of the conversation on the command net was trying to discriminate between a non-combatant and a combatant. And constantly, okay, there's a blue van, that's civilians, don't engage it. Okay, behind him are two white vans, they just shot at Alpha Company, you need to engage them. So constantly it was packing, don't shoot the blue van, get the white van, there's an old man over here, don't shoot him, shoot him.
They were not always successful in distinguishing fighters from civilians.
We didn't expect this attack. A lot of civilians, families, ran into the convoy, and they were shot and crushed. The Americans were moving so fast, and they were just firing at random. My cousin was on his way to work in his car. The Americans fired a warning shot. He stopped and started moving backwards. But they shot him, and it threw him out of his car.
By late morning, the Americans had sliced through Baghdad's southwestern suburbs and joined up with the US forces at the airport.
When our vehicles pulled into the airport, the great majority of them were on fire on the outside of them, and it was all our duffel bags and all that had all been shot up. The vehicle itself was intact, but all our stuff on the outside was burning up.
The first Thunder Run actually was a hell of a lot tougher of a fight, I think, than any of us anticipated. But it turned out okay.
The American raid had revealed there were at least some Iraqis still prepared to fight. But it had come at a major cost to the civilian population. To the south, the British continued to pursue a more cautious approach in Basra. They'd gathered intelligence and bided their time for almost 2 weeks, to the irritation of some American commanders. But slowly, they too were tightening the screw.
We put precision airstrikes in against the Ba'ath Party headquarters, the Directorate of Intelligence, the Fedayeen headquarters, and so forth. So we attacked the regime targets.
On the night of April the 4th, a major opportunity presented itself.
We got information that Chemical Ali was conducting a meeting in a house in the center of Basra.
Chemical Ali was the overall commander of the regime, Fedayeen, the armed forces in the southern part of Iraq. And it's not called Chemical Alley without good reason. It was very clear to me both before and during this operation that the Shia people were terrified of this man, terrified of him.
Just before dawn on April the 5th, American F-16s took off to strike the target. At the Pentagon, they watched the attack live through aerial surveillance. The video they later released was less graphic than the original.
We're watching this video of the attack, and the first weapon comes in, and then the second weapon comes in and strikes the building. And you're able to see bodies like rag dolls flying up into the air. And I'll tell you, we sat there and we were cheering, thinking, yeah, we just got Chemical Ali. Someone who has killed his own people, someone who is just an evil man is now dead. And we rejoiced at it.
Only later did it become clear that Chemical Ali had not been killed, and there were innocent victims.
There were 17 civilians killed there, and we didn't get Chemical Ali. And suddenly, I don't feel so good about this target. And you start to wonder who those rag dolls were that you saw flying through the air.
Most of the dead came from neighboring families. It was one of the worst losses of civilian life in the campaign in the south. But it proved a turning point. In Basra, it was widely believed Chemical Ali had been killed. And as news of the strike spread through the city, the effect was dramatic.
During the course of that day, we got indications that the policemen were no longer on street corners, that soldiers were not seen openly on the streets. We got information that members of the Ba'ath Party were leaving Basra. 2 of the battle groups had planned raids for the following morning. I said to the commanding officers, well, knock on the door, i.e. continue these raids, and if the door opens, keep going.
So I went back and I said, right, you know, we're going to do this, we're not going to muck around with the company squadron, we'll take the whole battle group.
On the morning of April the 6th, the entire British 7th Armoured Brigade, the Desert Rats, rolled into Basra. Those defenders still at their posts were taken by surprise. Some resorted to suicidal tactics.
There was a tank about 2 vehicles in front of me. And some lunatic jumped out of a bunker, climbed up on top of onto the tank, and then fired directly at the tank commander's periscope. And the vehicle immediately behind then shot this chap off the barrel.
Everywhere I looked, there was a limb here, a head there, pieces of head floating in this water next to us. And I was scared at this point. I thought, I do not want to end up like this. There was blood and guts everywhere. And then it just went into autopilot then. The next thing, as per drills, move.
By mid-morning, the British had broken through the thin defensive crust around the city.
The CEO of the Black Watch came up on the radio and said, I'm 3 kilometers into Basra, I'm going to keep going.
We drove down to more and more cheers, more and more waving, and no contact at all, really.
By late afternoon, the British were in downtown Basra. At last, the coalition had its images of liberation and celebration.
It was something like the liberation of Paris. I mean, you had hundreds of people laying in the road, waving, cheering, and all the rest of it.
The civilian population was ecstatic to see us, very happy, hands up, waving, trying to come over and see us and trying to talk.
3 British soldiers died that day. The British felt their cautious tactics were vindicated.
If you told me on the 19th of March that I could get into a defended city of 1.25 million with the loss of only 3 lives, I'd have taken it. Of course I would have. And I think that history would show this was probably the lightest casualties, I think, in any urban operation that's ever taken place. To both troops on both sides and to...
In the American 5th Army Corps on the edge of the city, following the fall of Basra.
This is the fight that all the Marines have been wondering when we're going to get into it. This is the time, all right?
The Marines had been given the job of storming the east of the city. As the young Marine commanders briefed their troops, they anticipated serious resistance. The mood was aggressive.
If it moves, it gets destroyed by anything we have. I don't care about collateral damage at this point. This is enemy territory, and if we got to rubble every building, that's what we'll do. All right?
But the Iraqi army was retreating in chaos. Colonel Mahmoud Shahan's unit was the last to fall back across the Diyala River, marking the eastern boundary of Baghdad.
It was every man for himself. You just had to make your own decisions. The bombardment was so heavy, and it made no attempt to distinguish between civilian and military areas. They were hitting us with artillery, helicopters, and fighter planes.
On the morning of the 6th of April, he abandoned his position.
I got into a civilian car and I just went home. I left everything behind.
24 hours later, the Marines stormed the Diyala Bridge, just a couple of miles downriver.
Kilo Company with Captain Norton were the first to cross the bridge. They crossed the bridge, immediately seized the small buildings that were overwatching it.
I'm not totally sure how much incoming fire. I think for the most part the Iraqis had left that morning. I think there was sporadic fire coming across.
Press photographers had swarmed to what they believed would be an iconic event.
We're hearing lots of fire. But it becomes pretty apparent at that point that it's not incoming, that no one's shooting at us.
But as the Marines fanned out on the northern bank, they remained nervous, jittery, above all fearful of suicide bombers. Just at that moment, Wassan Juwaid was setting off from central Baghdad. She'd spent a day with relatives and was returning to her home close to the Diyala Bridge.
We had no idea the Americans were in the area. Our neighbors, a father and his son, had a Kia van. They gave us a lift.
Back at the Diyala River, the Marines were establishing defensive positions. They followed the American military doctrine of force protection, which puts the security of American personnel above all else. They were dug in, their guns pointing down the road towards Baghdad.
You're not going to stand out there in a road guard vest and stop vehicles and search them. This isn't, Northern Ireland. Okay, this isn't a police post. This is combat.
Once more, the Marines were surrounded by photographers. The first vehicle they saw was Wassan Juwaid's.
The first vehicle to come through was a blue minivan. We got to say about 7 or 8 city blocks away when the Marines saw it.
They start to scream and they start to say 800 meters, 600 meters.
And then everyone else then fires in unison.
And you have this silence, and the car is like...
My sister was hit straight away. I rushed towards her. that she'd been shot in the head. The driver and his son were shot too. The son, poor thing, didn't die immediately. There was blood spurting onto the back seat and onto the window. I looked down at my finger and saw it was dangling, almost cut off. Another finger had been blown off completely. I saw an American soldier coming towards the car. I pretended to be unconscious.
As she lay in the van, more cars drove into the American guns. It was only later the photographers were allowed forward to take photos. Almost all the victims were civilians.
There was an elderly man that had been shot that was with a cane. He was walking with a cane. He'd been shot on the right side of the street.
Suddenly, a hand appeared in the window of the blue minivan.
Oh, there's a family in the back. There's a family in the back of it.
Wassan and another survivor had sat there all night long, next to the bodies of their dead relatives, too terrified to move.
I begged them to let me get my sister out of the car, to bury her, but they wouldn't let me. I thought they were coming to bring freedom and democracy, not to hurt people. Why did they shoot our car? They could see us and they still shot us. The cars were full of civilian families. There were no soldiers in them.
Around a dozen civilians died that morning at the Diyala Bridge. In the chaos of the advance, such incidents were widespread.
William Tecumseh Sherman said, war is cruelty. There's no sense in trying to refine it. The crueler it is, the sooner it's over. I think he had pretty good insight to the nature of war. The technology changes, but the true nature of war doesn't. And it is not clean, it is not antiseptic, it is not surgical.
It would be some time before the truth dawned on the Marines that the eastern side of Baghdad was almost defenseless. In the west of Baghdad, it was a different story. There, the 3rd Infantry Division had a fight on its hands.
You had everybody fighting, because you had to. You had the staff guys fighting. You had the support platoon fighting. You had the medics fighting.
Following the success of his first Thunder Run, Colonel Perkins had devised an ambitious battle plan to seize the Iraqi capital in a single day.
Baghdad's the center of gravity, and if the city has fallen, then all hope is lost. If I'm in the city and I stay there, the war's over.
He'd headed straight downtown for Saddam's palaces, spreading panic among the Iraqi defenders. But he'd taken a huge risk. If the Iraqis could cut his supply lines, he'd be stranded. And it was on these supply routes that the Fedayeen now concentrated its attacks.
We get attacked from one position, and we hit them back hard. And then another one would hit us, and then we'd hit them back hard. Well, they outnumbered us.
The fiercest fighting was on Route 8, at a road junction codenamed Objective Curly by the Americans.
It was chaos. We knew that we were outnumbered, we knew we were surrounded, we knew that we had walked into a well-executed and well-planned ambush. We were fighting for our lives.
It was at that moment that I thought to myself, okay, this might be it. They may have figured something out and they've got our number today.
Locals watched as the Fedayeen hurled themselves at the American guns.
They fought like heroes. I saw them with my own eyes. They'd run down the street, throw themselves to the ground, put a rocket in the RPG and fire, calling out for holy war. One of them had a bullet hole in his back. But he insisted on being given an RPG so that he could keep on fighting.
Once more, civilians were caught up in the fighting.
Good people stay home. So the people that are out there watching you, they don't need to be out there. They're not typically innocent people.
Iraqi civilians saw it differently.
We heard someone shouting, "My father's head's been blown off." He was knocking on doors, he was covered in blood. I shouted to him, "Get down or they'll shoot you." And just at that moment, he was shot in the chest.
Ahmed Wahid and his family were fleeing the Marines at the Diyala Bridge when they drove directly into the fighting at Objective Curly.
This soldier looked at us from the turret of his tank. I was making signs to him so that he would stop firing. But it was no good. He just kept on shooting at me and at my mother. I was hit twice. My mother fell dead in my arms.
By midday, the resistance was flagging. Colonel Perkins felt able to order his supply convoys to run the gauntlet up Route 8.
They're coming under a hail of fire, tires being shot out, windshields being shot out. But guys are up there in the 50 cal shooting back, shooting with the M16s, 9 mils to get these supply vehicles into the center of Baghdad.
Iraqi fighters fled in panic.
An Iraqi brigadier came running into my house. He was afraid. I was standing by the door. He shouted at me, "Get down, get down." I asked him what was happening. He said there were bodies everywhere, even on the rooftops. He said the Americans showed no mercy.
Colonel Perkins would spend the night in Saddam's palace.
I knew that, the tide had turned on this war. In other words, that we were in Baghdad, and there's probably no way that they could kick us out of the city.
19 days after crossing the Kuwait border, less than a week after the breakthrough at the Karbala Gap, the Americans had penetrated to the very heart of the regime.
The 7th was the point at which I think we broke the back of the regime, that we had established ourselves in Baghdad, that the coalition was there and they were there to stay.
There was a sense that we were getting close to the end of major combat operations.
But the Americans wanted Saddam dead or captured. That afternoon, they tried again to assassinate him. The Americans had occupied Saddam's palace in the center of Baghdad, but the Iraqi dictator himself remained elusive. That afternoon, the Americans got another intelligence tip.
My boss came into the office and he said to me, "Hey Mark, we've got some intelligence, we know where Saddam is."
There would be a meeting at these coordinates, in these buildings, and it would be populated by extremely high-level players within the Ba'ath Party and within the Iraqi leadership structure.
By now, Garlasco was growing wary of such tips.
I think that the evidence was sketchy. It was good enough to send forces in on the ground and see if he's really there, but I was reticent to drop 8,000 pounds of high explosives.
His objections were overruled. The intelligence was quickly passed to the crew of a B-1 bomber, already in the air over central Iraq.
We were told, turn direct Baghdad, we've got a priority 1 leadership target for you, and then stand by for coordinates. And the words we got were basically, this is a big one, don't miss.
The target was in the wealthy Al-Mansur district in the west of Baghdad. Abdul Masih had just returned home for lunch.
Everything was normal. People were just moving around as normal. I had my lunch, and then, half an hour later, I went out again.
In the skies above Baghdad, the intelligence passed to the B-1 was less precise than usual.
We actually got 2 sets of coordinates about 100 feet apart. My guess is that whoever was making these decisions looked at the buildings and thought, well, just to play it safe, to make sure that we do get the people we're after, we're gonna hit two separate target points there.
One of the target points was Abdul Masih's home.
We annihilated that target area. Emotionally, there's just a couple moments to think, wow, okay, we did that. Now let's move on to the next target area.
Here was the first victim we dug out from my own family. Here in the middle, we found Mariam, my niece, Malana, my older daughter. Then we got to the kitchen, where we found my wife, my little daughter, Lana. I dug them out with my bare hands. I carried them with my own hands, and I buried them with my own hands.
The Americans had missed again. 18 civilians died instead. The attack was based on an intercept of a satellite phone. These intercepts can be traced to within a radius of 100 meters of where the phone is being used. A human source on the ground was needed to point towards a more precise location. It now seems almost certain this source pointed to the wrong house.
I think the way that we went at it, the intelligence that we had, maybe was not as good as we thought it was.
The bulk of the other leadership strikes during the war were based on similarly flawed intelligence. 50 attempts were made to kill Iraqi leaders. Not a single one was successful.
The targets were all struck. Whatever the U.S. aimed at was hit, and hit magnificently. Buildings destroyed, smoking holes in the ground, that sort of thing. The problem is, the people who the U.S. was aiming at were not there. These leadership strikes led to the highest number of civilian casualties in the air war.
Did I expect to kill a lot of leaders? No. But we wanted to strike those facilities that they could man out of, and we wanted to put them on the run. So there may be a 3 to 4% chance that I'm actually going to strike the leader, but it is very well worth it attacking him.
If it was their families here, would they give approval to attack and destroy them? I'm alone. My children, my family, they all died here. Only I am left.
So where was Saddam? In fact, he'd spent much of the war at this house, about a mile away. It was never targeted. The day after the Al-Mansour strike, Saddam told close followers here that he'd been betrayed. Then he fled to the north of the city. There, on April the 9th, far from feeling hounded by airstrikes, he felt confident enough to stage another walkabout.
I'd always hoped to meet him. I wished him victory, and he thanked me. He handed me his gun by the handle. It had the president's seal on it.